getting started with Vue. Very excited about that. And then Justin Meyer, that's me. I'm going to talk a little bit about how to make streaming services and consume them in JavaScript. And then next month, we have Grant, who's going to talk about WebSockets. So if you want to learn about how to do real-time, that's a really good come next month. And then I want to thank our sponsors. Is there anybody here from Cars right now? No. They're downstairs. They might come up later. I'll let them talk then. And then I also want to thank Bitovi. Anybody here from Bitovi? Yes, someone is. We also sponsor this event. That's me. I'm the one from Bitovi. So thanks for everybody for coming. And that is all I have on my list. With no further ado, Tanya. Thank you. Test. Is that yours?
Yeah.
Okay.
Let's go next.
Say something.
Hello? Okay.
It works? Cool. All right, one more time because I messed up the intro. Tanya.
Hello everyone. This presentation is going to kind of be a mini lecture on what Vue is, and then the second half will kind of be a technical overview of the code itself. So it's kind of going to cover what Vue is and then how to use it. So as for who I am, I'm a front-end software engineer. I work for a startup in Chicago. The startup uses both React and Vue. So I'm familiar with both of those technologies. And I'll kind of cover the similarities and differences between them. I also write and create open source projects, and I write tutorials. So I've written for DigitalOcean, Envato Tuts, SitePoint, LogRocket. There's a whole bunch of them out there. So if you're Googling stuff, I might come up at some point, and you'll recognize me. And I changed careers from chef to developer in 2015. And so here I am now. And this is based off of a tutorial that you can find on my website. Tiny.dev, really easy to remember and find. So if you are interested in what you saw and it kind of went too fast or you wanted to see more, to see the full version, just go to the website, look up Vue, and you'll find it.
Tanya, we might adjust your. Does it sound a little echoey to everybody?
Yes.
Yeah. maybe move it more center, or it might help you actually talk.
Oh, that's fine.
Let's just hit this one more time.
Hello? Is that better?
Any better? Maybe.
Yes? No?
Okay, we'll try that for a moment. Yeah.
All right, so an overview of what we're going to go over, what Vue is. Vue versus React, because I assume a lot of people here, if you've used the framework at all, it's probably React. Prerequisites, what you need to already know in advance before you actually use Vue. Setup, here's two ways to kind of set up Vue, a very simple way that people who maybe have only used jQuery might be familiar with, or using the whole Node ecosystem with Webpack, Babel, and everything else. The anatomy of a Vue file, the core concepts of Vue, and at the end I'll just kind of go over how to do API calls with Vue. So what is Vue? It's an open source JavaScript framework, just like Angular or React or Svelte is a new one that's kind of come out. What it kind of has different than the other ones is it's not backed by a large corporation at all. So it's written by a man named Kevin Yu. Unlike React is by Facebook, Angular is by Google, and so on. And as far as popularity goes, it's actually the most popular one right now, with 150,000 stars on GitHub compared to React's 140, which is just kind of what people look at to see how popular one is over the other. So why use Vue? Pretty much the same reasons you use any other front-end framework. Makes it easy to manage state in an application. You can keep your DOM in sync with state. The UI is totally separate, so you don't have to worry about manipulating the UI and the data at the same time. It has reusable components. It's quick and easy to build new applications. And it has a healthy ecosystem, very easy to find support for common issues, using Stack Overflow or the issues on their GitHub repository. Prerequisites to using Vue, you already have to know HTML and CSS, that's kind of a given. JavaScript as well, if you try to jump into using Vue without really being familiar with JavaScript, it's going to be too much to take on at once, in my opinion. There's a lot of ES6, which is ECMAScript 2015, that's used pretty much across the board, so you should definitely be familiar with that. A lot of times I see people have a question, they think it might be related to React or Vue, but it's actually just a newer JavaScript feature that they're not familiar with. Just to get the simplest form of Vue set up, you don't need to know Node or Webpack or Babel or anything, but to make something that's production ready, you do. So being familiar with that is important. And working with REST APIs is kind of any production level app is going to be doing that. So again, not a prerequisite to using Vue in the first place, but it is to making something useful with it. Similarities and differences between React and Vue. They both use a virtual DOM, which is kind of a side DOM that checks changes to the state and allows for very easy and quick updates to what you actually see on the screen. They both have the concept of reusable components. They both have a life cycle, which is before a component mounts, after it mounts, and if it's unmounting. They solve the same problems. If you want to build a front-end app, especially a single-page application, they're both going to do it for you in just slightly different ways. Differences. Vue is more of a framework, React is more of a library. So Vue kind of sets up the way you're going to make your app a lot more. So if you don't want to think as much about how you're going to structure it, Vue kind of does that for you. And one of the really cool things about Vue is it has a rich ecosystem of official companion libraries. So if you need global state management, you need a router, you need a command line tool interface, Vue has an official version of all of those. Whereas other things like React, they have ones that maybe people use a lot, but there might be a couple of different versions. So it makes that a lot easier to decide. And another cool thing that Vue has is scope CSS and SCSS. So each component will have styles that are scoped just to that component. Makes it a lot easier to not have CSS that's, being overwritten in other areas of the app. This is a problem that React has many ways to solve, and none of them are perfect, and this solution is actually quite good. Vue uses templates, which look a lot more like HTML. React uses JSX, which stands for JavaScript XML, and it's actually just JavaScript. And another big difference is the data binding. Vue uses two-way data binding, which goes from a parent to a child, and a child can also pass it back up. React is always only going down. So the easiest way to kind of just show you how Vue works is with a beginner install, just an index.html file and nothing else. So no worrying about the ecosystem, Webpack, Babel, anything else. It's just load in Vue and use it. This is a lot easier for people who have no familiarity with frameworks whatsoever, just to see how it gets loaded in. So in this index.html example, you have a script that's loading in Vue. That's all it is. The entirety of Vue is delivered in that CDN, and the entire app will be in the app ID. So to bring in a Vue instance, you just call a new Vue, and I'm setting a variable of a message, which the template will display. So here we have a template variable, the element we're targeting, which is the app ID, and we're just setting a static string value to it. And what that looks like is just hello Vue. Very simple, but you're bringing in a variable and processing it in the HTML. So while that kind of just shows how to bring Vue into an app in the simplest way possible, a production application would never actually do it that way. They'd be using the whole setup, writing the newest JavaScript, and compiling it down to the something that all browsers can understand, and so on. So Vue makes that easy with another one of its companion libraries, which is the Vue CLI, which you can install and then just run Vue create, name of your app. It's just like create React app if you've ever used that. So here's just a screen of installing it. And then here's you're running a server on port 8080 here with default app setup. So this just displays kind of what Vue create makes for you. And the same thing that we just did in index.html is happening here. It's mounting the entire Vue app on an ID called app. So everything you do in Vue is done in Vue files, and the app itself is a simple div, nothing else. So everything you're going to look at in a Vue app is in the src folder. And it has that main.js, which is the entry point. So we'll focus on app.vue, which is the entry component. And just as a side note, there's a Vue developer tools that is very useful when developing. It shows you the state of your components, the events, everything else. I'm not going to really go too much into it, but it's good to know that it exists. It makes it a lot easier to develop. The anatomy of a Vue file always consists of three things: a template, a script, and a style. And it's all in one file. And this is kind of interesting because back in the days of 2006 jQuery-esque web development, there was a big thing about separation of concerns. All of your JavaScript should be in one file, all of your HTML should be in another file. But Vue kind of goes with a different approach, that anything that is related to the component should go together. So the way it looks, the way it's laid out, and the functionality. So the structure, the JavaScript, and the styles, all in one file. So the template part looks just like what we had before. A div with an ID of app. We're rendering some variable, and it's inside of a template. The script looks just like how we rendered the string to that variable message. And that's all we have in there so far, just the name and the message. Style, I'm not really going to go too much into it because either you know CSS or you don't, but just know that you have this scoped option on a style tag. It means if I say text align center in app, it's only going to be there. Any other component is not going to see that. So at the end of the day, all three of those things, template, script, and style, are in one file, in this case, app.vue. So right here, I'm just rendering an H1 with the message, which is exactly what you see, with CSS applied and everything. So it seems kind of like a lot of work just to do the exact same thing we did before. But now you have the whole ecosystem. You could be running ESLint, compiling down to the newer versions to older versions of JavaScript and so on. So what I'm going to go over now is just the core Vue concepts, and this is kind of going to be like a walkthrough, but just kind of a quick overview, not a tutorial of creating a whole app, which you can find on the website if you go visit it, but I'm just kind of going to overview it as quickly as possible so that you can see about components, data, also known as state and props, how Vue handles loops and conditionals, methods and events, and the life cycle. If you know how to do these things, you can start building productive applications with Vue. So components, we've already seen one, app was a component, but you generally would not put your entire application inside of app.js. You would want things to be more organized, so you'd make a lot of components with reusable parts. And a component can have methods, and it can have its own local state, and it can take properties from parent elements. So in this little app, it's just kind of a table of employees. I used the examples from Silicon Valley employees, but just to display a table. And here I have a hard-coded table, just looks exactly the same as what you would see in HTML. So I've created this employee table.vue, I've given it a name, and in app.vue, I'm going to import that component that I just made. And as you can see in the template there, I'm loading an employee table. And it basically just looks like an HTML element. You kind of just created your own custom HTML element. So you insert the new component into the template, you import it into the script, and you also have to register it. Once you do that, you can use the component. And what you see is the hard-coded data just in rendered form. So the problem with just hard-coding data like that, obviously, is it's very hard to work with. You don't want to have to actually look into the DOM, see what the data inside the DOM is. You want to just have an array or an object that you can work with. And you do that by, instead of hard-coding the data into the rows, have an array of objects that has all the data that should be in the tables. So Vue has data, which is like state, and you can pass state down as props. Same exact concept in React. So in this case, I'm going to take all the data that was in that table that was hard-coded, put it into an array of objects, with your name, your email, your ID. I've called that array employees, and I'm passing it down as a prop called employees to the table. And putting a colon in front of something designates that what is going into it is JavaScript. If I were to not put that colon there, it would think it's a regular HTML attribute. This is actually really useful when doing something like styling, because you might put class equals something, and then you have a conditional class that depends on some JavaScript. Makes it very easy to conditionally render CSS on the component. So in the employee table, you have to have it listening for any props that are coming in. So I have an employees array coming in, and I'm just telling it that. So now the data is being passed down from app.vue to employee table.vue. The data is created, and in order to display it, we have to loop through it. But since the display is in a template, you have to do it the Vue way. You can't actually put a JavaScript for loop in the template. It has to be done in a format that looks kind of like HTML. So Vue has special directives for that. If you want to use a for loop in a template, it's v-for. If you want to use an if statement, it's v-if, v-else if, v-else, and so on. And using v-for, you can loop through arrays. Using v-if, you can conditionally render whatever content you want. So in this case, I've taken out all of the hard-coded TDs from that table. And there's just a comment there saying, here's where we're going to loop through the entries. And using v-for, and just a for in loop, you loop through the employees array and render a row for each one. And the way it appears is exactly the same as before, but now the data is in a format where we can easily add to it, remove from it, modify something in the array, and it will immediately be displayed. So methods and events, each Vue instance, just like it has a data object, or a data function, has a methods object. And you can put any method that you'll use on that component on the methods. You can also use native events, click events, submit events, change events. And the way Vue sees that is with the @ symbol. So @click is the same as onClick, @submit is the same as onSubmit, so on. So over here, just to display how that works, I'm bringing in a form where you're going to be able to add a new employee. So here's the form. I'm not really going to explain how an HTML form works, but just to show you that I'm now rendering the name and email. You can add them. We have to make it function. So this is where it gets a little confusing, because this is where the two-way data binding in Vue comes in. You can submit something on a child and tell the parent that it happened. So this happens using something in Vue called emit, which is basically like a radio is emitting a signal, and something that's listening to it might see it. And that's what's happening here. In the form, I have a submit event that calls the local method handle submit. But once that happens, it emits an event called add employee. And along with the second parameter is the data that I'm adding. This is where Vue DevTools comes in handy, because when I click that Add Employee button, you can see an event has been emitted called Add Employee. It came from the employee form component, and it contains a payload of an object with name Ehrlich. Well, should have been email, but you get the point. So on app.vue itself, we're not receiving that emitted event, but we want to modify the original array. So in order to do that, you have a custom event that it's listening for. Just like there was @click or @submit, employee form is saying, I'm emitting an event called addEmployee. And on app, once that happens, call the addEmployee method. So this whole concept is just a little bit difficult to wrap your head around if you're only used to passing data down one way. But it kind of makes it easier to just not think about passing things down through multiple components. So over here I have the employee form. It's emitting that addEmployee event. And now once I click on it, I can do it. Okay, last thing is just lifecycle and rest. So in a real production Vue app, you have a lifecycle and you're using asynchronous functions. You're probably going to retrieve all your data before you display anything on the screen, and you need to asynchronously send an event that will update the app itself. So just like how React has component will know, component did update, Vue has created, mounted, destroyed, and so on. So an example of just an async function, you're fetching something from a URL, you're doing something with it, or you're handling the error. In this example, I'm just kind of using a JSON placeholder, which is a cool website that mocks an API for you. But let's just say I'm getting all my employee data from that URL. And I want that to run before I display anything on the Vue page. So I would just do that by calling this created and awaiting get employees, which was that asynchronous function I made. And that's pretty much everything. You know what Vue is, you know what makes it similar and different to React or some other frameworks, and you know the simplest way to set up a Vue project, but also how to do it in a production-ready form. So the most important concepts: components, state, props, how Vue goes about rendering lists and conditionals, handling events, and using the lifecycle. And that's it. If anything didn't make sense, go to tiny.dev, read the actual tutorial, walk through it, and that's it.
Any questions?
Yeah, for the scopes of the CSS, you can't put them in separate files?
I'm sure you could, but you could like load a global CSS file for your entire project. But if you had some very specific CSS and you only wanted to apply to that specific component, you could very easily do it with the scope of CSS.
You have to specify scope.
You have to put scoped in there. If you don't, then anywhere that that component exists, it will be outside of the component as well. Just like if you were to import the CSS file in a regular project.
The scope, does that actually create like a wrapper around?
I mean, to be honest, I don't know how it's implemented underneath the hood. I just know that it puts an ID onto your actual element so that it knows to only apply to that ID.
Okay. That's how sometimes you design SSS where you have IDs as your main, and then all the classes below. So
yeah.
Do that with the and it's ES6, so it supports like classes and.
Yeah, with the whole Webpack and Babel setup, you can use the newest JavaScript.
So which one do you prefer, like for new projects, React or Vue?
I don't know, it's kind of hard to choose. They both have their pros and cons. I think one of the big pros of React is just that more people are familiar with it. Like at work, we use both, and I'm just starting a new project today, and I think I might go with React just because more of the team knows React. But as far as personal preference, I like them both. I really can't choose.
All right, thank you. Do you know how? So you can add and remove, or you can like splice out records from that array, and Vue will just update.
Yeah.
Do you know how that works?
I don't know underneath the hood. I just know that I do it and it gets done.
For the styles, if you put an ID on the style tag, you can actually delete it just using like get on the website IDs, and then you can remove all those different styles. You don't have a CMS.
Right.
We'll have the SSH as well. Just for instance, you can verify this
Class.
All right, everybody hear me? Yeah? Cool. All right, so hello again, I'm Justin. I am going to give an excerpt from another presentation I gave that was called Learn to Paddle in the Fast Waters of Streamable Web Apps. This is about, the whole presentation, which I can link to, is about the development of VelociRender, which is a server-side rendering framework that someone introduced like in a 10-minute talk a few months ago. But what that server-side rendering framework does, it's kind of like an application accelerator. An app that uses it is on the right, an app that doesn't use it is on the left. The big difference to spot here, which will be important, what we're going to learn about, is the application on the right. If I can move this out of the way. Let's restart it. The one on the right, you'll notice that the items come in progressively. There's going to be a database query, and as the database returns records, we are going to throw those up to the browser, and the browser is going to render them right away. And I'm going to talk about how we made that work, that slice of this server-side rendering framework. So we're really going to just spend the time talking about streams, a technology called NDJSON, a format of JSON called NDJSON, new line delimited JSON, and fetch, the fetch API in the browser. This is a little complex. So if people have questions, feel free to raise your hand while I'm going through it. And I'm happy to answer questions during my presentation. So the idea, again, is if you take your single-page JavaScript application, it's got this life cycle where a user comes in, you send back HTML, then JavaScript gets requested, then you send JavaScript back, then, if this is Vue, Vue requests your data, makes those RESTful calls to your service layer, and then you hit a database. The database goes through and finds all the records that match your query, then takes all those records, converts them to JSON, sends them back up to the browser, and then the browser has to render all of those at once. And what I want to do is change that to work streaming, so that you hit the database, and as that database produces the first record, you send that first record on its way to the browser right away to be displayed to the user immediately. And then as more records come out, or streaming out of the database, the user sees more and more records. And this is the way to improve things, especially if you have a very slow query. And we'll talk about the performance implications of this at the end. Yeah?
Is there like any special database that does that, or?
Yeah, so Postgres is able to do it, Mongo can do it, a lot of them can. I will show an example specifically with Postgres. But first we have to learn about streams. I'm about to show, there's a whole wide variety of streaming technologies. Node has its implementation of streams. You might have heard of like Rxjs, which is a streaming library. What I'm going to show is the browser now has an implementation of streams, and we're going to learn about the readable stream class in the browser. Streams, you can think of them as like, I don't know flowing river of data. Essentially, it's kind of like a promise, where a promise you can listen for when it has data, but streams can keep giving you data over time. And because streams are this temporal thing, where like, hey, I'm just sending data out. I'm sending data out. Consumers of that, there's a lot of like timing issues involved and things like that. The readable stream, which we'll look at, has a whole lot of good features, things like cancellation and back pressure. I actually think it's a really well-designed interface. And if there's time or interest, someone can talk to me about like the details of it and why I like it so much. But I'm not going to go into detail on that. I'm just going to show what it looks like to create a readable stream and then use one in the fetch API. So here's what it looks like to create our own readable stream that is going to emit random numbers over time. You can create a new instance of readable stream, and when someone connects to that readable stream and wants to start pulling values out of it, this start method will be called. And I'm going to show how we implement that in a second to emit random numbers. There's also a cancel that gets called when nobody is listening to that stream anymore. So when someone says, hey, I want random numbers, start producing it, all this implementation does for this number stream is essentially just produces every second produces a random number and queues that value for somebody to listen to and somebody to see. And then if the number was greater than 0.9, it can essentially terminate itself to say, I am done producing values, and then clean itself up. And then if the outside world said, hey, we're done with you, stream, this is what it looks like to essentially cancel itself, to tell itself that, hey, I'm done, I'm going to stop emitting numbers. Clear interval would do that to clear the interval that was in start. Okay, so now we have some understanding of like how to construct a readable stream. Let's see what it looks like to pull these random numbers out of it. So this will get better in a moment, but this is kind of, if you understand promises, this is maybe the easiest way to look at how you would pull numbers out of a readable stream, or out of this number stream. So anybody familiar with Rxjs? What are the two, like there's, what are the terms? There's, there's like single context, there's like subjects, and there's normal observables. Well, what's that called? It's like, do you know what I'm talking about? Where like a normal observable, every time you subscribe to it, gets forked. But subjects in Rxjs are not forked.
They can multicast?
Multicast, yeah. So this, thank you. These are like Rxjs and are not multicast by default. You can convert them to that just like you have to Rxjs. But that's one person knows what I'm talking about, but that's just fine. So these are single casts, and you have to essentially say, I am the one subscriber to the number stream, and that's what you do when you get a reader. So when you get a reader, now you can actually start pulling values from it with this read method. And the read method returns a promise. When that promise resolves, you get a result. And the result will have a value property that is the random numbers. So this is how you would console log all the random numbers that are being produced. And then if the source stream said, I'm done, I produced a number over 0.9, I'm exiting, result done would be truth, it would be true, and then you would exit. Forgot to mention this. I want to also keep reading numbers, so what I need to do is after I console log a number, I need to call read again, and then start, like basically keep looping kind of recursively. Call process result with the result, which is this function, and just keep doing that until you're out of numbers. Now, obviously, no one wants to write this all the time to just be able to get values out. So it can be progressively easier, and ECMAScript 6 and ECMAScript 7 are making it easier. So if, as Tanya already showed, there's an await where you can wait for a promise to resolve, and you can do that in this kind of, you don't need a callback to wait for that to happen. So here I could get my number stream, get my reader out of it, wait for the next value, log the value, or exit my while loop. And then when I talk about ECMAScript 7, or is this 8? I forgot where this is in. There's a new for await syntax. Has anybody seen this? No? Okay, cool. So in JavaScript, they added the iterator symbol, which allows you to use for, just normal for of, to iterate through anything if it implements the iterator symbol. Now there is also a async iterator symbol, and NumberString provides that. So what it allows you to do is essentially set up a for loop that runs the body of the for loop every time a new value is emitted. So this makes this syntax very easy to like get a stream of numbers and then just loop do some code every time a new value is emitted. Is this in Node already, like Node 12? I don't know how you've seen it.
I haven't used it in Node. But
Yeah, I haven't used it in Node either. But it's cool. It's going to make things, because Node, I don't think it supports, their streams support the async iterator yet. So I haven't seen it if it's going to land in Node yet. But when it does, I don't know. I will be excited, but I get excited by weird things. Okay, so, now we can see how we might be able to get, a stream of random numbers. That's not exciting. What we really want to be able to do is go make a network request to an API endpoint and get some objects back, and then maybe start putting those on the page, right? So we're going to hit a database query essentially, and we're going to get a streaming response and write those out. The new fetch API, so this is making a request to /API. The response that you get on the body, that is a string. That is a readable string. And that, if you, essentially if you read that, and let's say the server we're just producing the string ABC, you would console log, well, if your server was slow enough, you might console log an array of 97, then an array of 98, then an array of 99. You can actually get that streaming response and essentially read each byte as it comes out. You basically get an array of bytes, but the array length that you get depends on how slow your server is, basically, how it's sending out its bytes. So this is how you can use fetch to actually connect to a streaming response and see the raw bytes. So okay, fine, raw bytes, who cares? I don't want to see an array of A, B, C. I want to see probably JSON objects. I want to see at least strings. I want to see what the strings that are represented here look like. So the browser now also supports this handy little util that can convert from those bytes, this text decoder really, can convert from those bytes to a string. And this text decoder is stateful, so if you have, if you have encoding that like your server sent like half of a character, essentially as bytes through, it can see that, understand that, and then when the next bytes come in, it will basically always be giving you whole characters back. It's pretty useful. So with this text decoder, we could get a streaming response, and as characters are coming out from the server, decode them into strings. Now, the final piece of this is you need to send back a streaming format. So your server, it can't just send back JSON. I mean, it could, but JSON isn't a very good streaming format because it's just not, right? Like you can have nested objects and things like that. You don't really know where like the chunks are. So there's this format that's starting to be widely used, which is called new lines eliminated JSON, which essentially, as your database is producing records, you essentially create a file. You're going to stream out a file where each record is you serialize it to a JavaScript object string, and you end it with a new line. And then as every row comes out, you just serialize it, put a new line, serialize it, put a new line. And what your front end will do is it'll see the stream of bytes, and every time it sees a new line character, essentially an unescaped new line character, it knows that everything before it is a JavaScript object, and to convert that to a JavaScript object and give it back to you to put on the page. So I'm not going to show what that looks like because I created a library that does exactly that, which is NDJSON, which if you essentially you can take fetch, and if you are you can fetch to a NDJSON service, and if that gives you back that new line delimited data, you can convert that streaming response into a stream of objects, right? So as long as you're giving back, the server is streaming that NDJSON, this does that conversion job for you, so that object's reader itself is your records from your database. And then, you know, what you probably do in real life is like create a table row and write out each record as it comes, but I'm just console logging it here. So, you know, you could, this is what it would look like if you're using that library to connect to a streaming response, streaming service, and write out the response as it comes in. Any questions about this? Okay, one or two more slides, or a few more. Okay, so now let's take a look at what it looks like to build that streaming service. So I'm going to build it in Node with Postgres, and that's it. So the first thing is I'm going to get Postgres, and I'm going to connect to a Postgres database. Then there's this libraries that people built, Postgres Query Stream. This allows you to make streaming queries with Postgres in Node. And then also someone created an NDJSON, what is it called in streams where you go from one to the next, just the converting? There's a name for that. Basically, to take a source stream and convert it to another output stream. There's a special term for that, but I forgot what it is.
Transform?
Huh?
Transform,
yeah. There's an NDJSON transform that somebody made. And we'll make use of that as well. So I'm essentially just going to create a server, and any request that comes in to my port is going to be handled by this. And I create one of those query streams to select every single to-do and order it by ID. It looks just like normal SQL. Then you pass that query to the Postgres client, and that gives you back a Node stream, which is different than those readable streams, but similar in concept. And then all I need to do is this is the stream of records, if you will. You know, this is going to be a stream of objects coming out of the database as they're found. And I'm going to take that stream of records, pipe it through the transformer, which is going to produce essentially a stream of strings, like essentially the JSON stringified objects. And then I'm going to pipe that right out to the result that we send out to the, you know, as part of the response body. So it's pretty simple to set up yourself. Any questions about this, how this works? Cool. Okay, so an analysis. Edited this slide today, and my edits are not there. Can you use it? It's actually in Chrome, Safari, and Firefox now. So yes, you can use it. Fetch is in all latest browsers. A lot of, at least the two databases I'm most familiar with, both support it. The only caveat is if you are using React, because React diffs, and you might have like that n² problem where like as a new record comes in streaming, that you tell React to do a diff. Well, it's a linear diff, and then a new record comes in, it's got another bigger diff, and then another record comes in, another bigger diff. It is a problem with React. I don't think Vue would actually have, well, it does do diffing too. I guess I would say if you're at the point where the performance of that matters so much, then just dip into creating DOM elements yourself and avoid the linear diff for every time a record gets created. Should you use it, if you have a database and your query for that database streams really well, it's actually almost always just a pure win. You should switch to this. If you have, the only minor case is if like people have a very slow connection and you have a tremendous amount of data you need to send them, it might not improve things. So let me show the analysis here and try to make sense of it. Essentially, what these two graphs are the same thing is essentially done at two different network speeds. Slow 3G, like fast, like Ethernet or something like that. I don't know what 30 megabytes is. And it's comparing if we produce, for this one, it's comparing if we produce 500 records. If essentially you think the database produced 500 records in 20 milliseconds. How does the performance of streaming the first record out and the last record out compare to if you just sent JSON? And we didn't do exhaustive testing, but the only place that things didn't go super well, that the stream first and last result, or at least, definitely the first is always faster than the equivalent just sending out JSON all at once. The only place where it doesn't go well is if you have a database that is very quick at producing a whole lot of records, and you're on a slow internet. Then, because essentially the network is so congested, the overhead of streaming slows things up. It would just be better in that case to just send it all up as one big chunk, because the pipes are so slow. And you're producing data so fast from your query. But as your query slows up, things get much better. And I can talk through this in more detail. But basically, it's a win almost everywhere except for this case. If you've got a very fast database, a lot of records, slow internet. And that's my presentation. Any questions about this? Yeah.
Are there some types of queries that are better for streaming than others?
So like search things, like if you're doing like full text search with Postgres, things that are non-indexable super well, those are going to be better. Any others?
Would a solution for this potentially be in regards to like offline support and running jobs?
So a solution for what part of this?
I'm just thinking about like if I were, you're saying that the connection is the problem, right? So
well, it's a comment for this right here.
Yeah.
It's a combination of your internet is really slow, so there's a little bit of overhead for sending a streaming response, and if there's a whole lot of data, and it's all like, you can think of this as it like has, you got a tiny little straw, right? And in this case, I produce all at once just a giant thing that's got to be shoved through that straw. It doesn't matter if I produce it all at once and try to shove it through that straw, or I produce it just slightly slower than all at once. That's what's happening here. In like the other ones where it's faster, it's more like in these, it's like, well, instead of all at once, maybe I'm producing it over a longer time. So like those first bytes kind of get through as I'm producing this bigger and bigger object that needs to go through. So some of the data can squeeze through that start as I'm still working on producing the full data set. That's why it's faster over here. But it's like if you can produce your full data set like almost immediately, and it doesn't matter like that straw's too tiny. You might as well not even begin putting things one at a time through that little straw. I don't know if that's analogy helps make more sense. Okay.
So you're talking about network overhead, because there's an X amount of time it's going to take to transmit the data, no matter what.
Yes.
And if you're calling a whole bunch of calls and get little pieces of data, and your network is slow enough, then that network overhead is going to negate
Yeah, you might as well just have
grabbing all the data at once.
Even though all the data still has to go through the little tube, it's like the little bit of overhead of doing it piece by piece.
Right.
Doesn't,
you're adding a head. You're basically adding a head and a tail.
A little bit, yeah.
To the data for each of those little pieces, and by doing it all at once, you only send one.
Yeah.
Chunk. So.
Yeah. So the real thing is for this technique, it's like you want to have slow queries. If you have a slow query, what I would recommend is if you have a really slow query, just use this library, run the exact same query, and just see what the first record, the distance between the first record and the last record to come out, right? As you, at least, I would probably put it as, if you see like a 100 millisecond gap, you should totally switch. Even a 50 millisecond gap, especially, like I said, it does depend on how many records you're totally sending through, but as your first to last record gets bigger and bigger, it gets more and more useful to do it this way. So this is with fetch. So the idea behind this is, like with WebSocket, you've got to initiate the WebSocket. This is just a normal. You can almost think of this as a normal AJAX request. You don't. With WebSockets, you can do similar things, but there'd be more overhead for the setup than there would be for just your standard HTTP fetch request.
Aggregate data, you probably just have to do it at the end, right? When it's done.
Oh, you mean in the client if you were like doing a sum of things?
And stuff, or
yeah.
Before that, after the last.
Yeah. I mean, this is really for like if you're, where I've used this specifically is in a very large company's reporting software for something that you buy music on. And, so that like huge amounts of data, and you want to like build the graph right away for like reporting, and you can, instead of the query taking 4 seconds and then the user can only see anything after 4 seconds, like they can see data coming in over historical time frames, right away. Much better user experience. All right. Thanks, everybody. And we'll see you at the next one. Was anybody from Cars here? I thought.
William Jack, this lovely man right here.
Do you want to come say anything about how awesome Cars is to work at? And
Woo!
I didn't know I'd be on the spot.
okay.
Yeah, sorry, Matt. I'll just give a quick note, if that's okay. So I work for Cars. Underneath the Cars umbrella is also Dealer Inspire. Dealer Inspire is based out of Naperville. Right now we actually have a handful of openings, full stack, React, Node development positions. They're actually open to remote developers as well. Right now at this time they're looking for folks who do have experience. One is a React developer, others are full stack React Node. We also, I talked to a few people who are WordPress, PHP. We also have a number of openings in that arena. So please obviously keep a lookout on Cars Careers page 2. We're probably done with hiring until the end of the year. That lovely stack is closer to Elixir, Phoenix, everything built out in AWS, so things have changed here at Cars a bit. But for Dealer Inspire, we're actively hiring, and we would love for any of you to apply.
And thank you, Cars, for hosting us. Really appreciate it. And one final thing is, we have one speaker lined up for next meetup. It'd be great to get another one, or for any future meetups. You can talk about anything you want. It can be for as short as like a minute. For next meetup, as long as like 30, 45 minutes. If you're a first-time speaker, shorter is easier. It works. And if you anything, like a lot of people are beginners here. So even if it's like, hey, I built this cool widget in the simple form in React. I think it's nice. I would like to show it. There are many like it, but this one is mine. That would be a great talk. So please contact me and the other organizers through meetup.com if you are interested in speaking. Love to have people, even a bunch of people, for like quick 5-minute talks. So thanks again, and hopefully see you next month.